tariffs. Now, lumber tariffs may sound like a super boring topic, and maybe it is, but there was an increase in lumber tariffs recently, and it ultimately hits your wallet, and so it's important to understand what's going on. And so let me explain. Here is the idea, generally. In Canada, most lumber is harvested from public lands, or what they call crown lands. In the US, most lumber comes from private lands. And the US lumber industry complains that the Canadian government is unfairly subsidizing its lumber industry by keeping the fees that loggers pay for timber low. In the US, they pay private rates. In Canada, they pay those public rates. And so that's the difference. And in the eyes of US lumber producers, this gives Canadian lumber companies an unfair advantage, which hurts the US business. So what do the US companies do? Well, they press the US government to apply tariffs to Canadian lumber. A tariff is a tax that's paid by importers when a good like lumber is imported into the country. These tariffs do a couple of things. First, they increase the cost of Canadian lumber, which makes US lumber more attractive to consumers. It also allows US producers to charge more for their product than they generally would be able to, simply because the alternatives coming in from Canada are more expensive. The US and Canada have been playing this game for decades now, and most recently, the Biden administration nearly doubled the tariffs on Canadian lumber from 8.05% to 14.54%. That is quite the jump. Now, here's the really crazy thing about lumber tariffs. They're really just a huge scam. What usually happens, and what has happened many times in the past, is that the Canadian lumber companies file complaints with the US Court of International Trade and the World Trade Organization, saying that the tariffs that the US is imposing violate international trade law, which they do. And so the Canadians usually win, which means that the US is forced to pay back Canadian lumber companies. So I know that was a lot, so let me just explain that one more time. The US slaps a tariff on Canadian lumber, the price of lumber goes up for everyone, and American consumers pay more. The US lumber companies make more money because they're able to charge higher prices, and then ultimately the US government, who again usually loses in these disputes, is forced to pay Canadian lumber companies back. So let me ask you this question: who gets screwed in this exchange? That's right, it's the American consumer. All of us, we end up paying more. The US lumber companies are fine, the Canadian lumber companies maybe went through some pain, but ultimately they're fine. And we're the ones that end up holding the bag. Now, it gets even worse than that though, because for the past 10, 20 years, Canadian lumber companies have been expanding their operations to the US and buying up farmland and mills in the South, in the Northwest. Companies like West Fraser, Canfor, and Interfor are all Canadian companies that now have extensive operations in the US. So they take advantage of that game on both sides of the border. So tariffs definitely increase prices, but let's get back to lumber supply and demand. So as I mentioned before, lumber prices